Welcome back to Through the Valley. This is your host, Bahar Alexander, executive coach, author, and speaker. Today feels like the beginning of something new. And that's not because we're leaving the last season behind, but because we are building upon it as a strong foundation. Over the past season, we walked through the invisible landscape of leadership. We explored integration, internal architecture, decision-making agility. We explored intuition, inner authority, executive presence. And if there was one word quietly woven through every episode, it was coherence. We spoke about it often, sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly. But today, I would like to bring it into the light, right to the forefront, because I believe coherence is one of those most misunderstood ideas in leadership. When people hear the word coherence, they often think of agreement, alignment, harmony, everyone thinking the same, everyone moving in the same direction. But life teaches us something entirely different about coherence. A forest isn't coherent because every tree is identical. An orchestra isn't coherent because every musician plays the same instrument. The human body isn't coherent because every organ performs the same function. Life never creates coherence by making its parts more alike. Life creates coherence by allowing every part to become more fully itself while remaining devoted to the flourishing of the whole. I believe leadership works exactly the same way. And that realization completely changed the way I think about communication. Because communication isn't simply the exchange of information, like most of us like to believe. One person broadcasts while the other receives. It is the process through which coherence becomes possible. Think about that for a moment. Every meaningful relationship in your life exists because communication made understanding possible. Every thriving team depends on communication to transform individual perspectives into shared reality. Every organization rises and falls according to the quality of the conversations taking place within it. Communication doesn't simply move information. It moves people. It moves trust. It moves understanding. It moves relationships. It moves possibility. Which means communication is far more than a leadership competency. It is the bridge between one human experience and another. Imagine standing on one side of a valley. On your side exists your experience, your beliefs, your intentions, your fears, your hopes, your meanings. Across the valley stands another human being. They have their own experiences, their own interpretations, their own fears, their own reality. Without a bridge, both realities remain isolated. I'm sure you've all seen that illustration of two people standing across from a line. One looks across the line and sees a 9, and the other looks across the line and sees a 6. Both perspectives are accurate. Both observe their own reality. But in that moment, the question remains, will I hold on to my perspective, or will I build a bridge of understanding? Communication is that bridge. It allows one reality to travel towards another, not to erase the differences, to create understanding despite of them. Perhaps that's why communication is simultaneously one of the most beautiful and one of the most fragile capacities we possess. Because every conversation offers us a choice. Will this conversation become another wall, or will it become a bridge? Over the years, I've noticed something fascinating. Most communication training teaches us how to speak more effectively, how to influence, how to negotiate, how to present, how to persuade. And these are all valuable skills. But they all assume the problem exists in the words. I don't believe it does. I believe communication problems rarely begin with language. They begin long before language appears. They begin inside the human being communicating. Because before words ever leave our mouths, they've already traveled through our internal architecture. They've passed through our beliefs, our assumptions, our emotional history, our survival strategies, our fears, our identity, our nervous systems. And by the time those words reach another person, they're carrying far more than information. They're carrying us. Which explains why two leaders can deliver the exact same message and create completely different outcomes. One conversation creates trust, the other creates resistance. One inspires ownership, the other creates compliance. One opens possibility, the other closes it. The words are identical. The coherence is not. I often tell leaders something that initially surprises them. People don't experience our intentions, contrary to common belief. They experience our coherence. I'm going to repeat that again. People don't experience our intentions. They experience our coherence. We may intend to empower someone, but if our nervous system communicates anxiety, people feel anxiety. We may intend to communicate trust, but if our behavior communicates control, people experience control. We may intend to create safety, but if we are protecting ourselves, others instinctively protect themselves too. Communication is never just verbal. It is energetic, relational, psychological, which means the quality of our communication can never exceed the quality of our coherence. And perhaps this is why so many conversations feel exhausting. Not because communication is difficult, but because maintaining incongruence requires enormous amounts of energy. That constant overthinking to uphold a certain image and to try to be a couple of hundred steps ahead of what is being spoken, that is exhausting. Saying what you don't believe, pretending certainty when you feel fear, trying to appear calm while internally overwhelmed, trying to influence while secretly seeking approval, trying to listen while preparing our response. Every one of these creates friction, and friction obstructs coherence, which leads us to the question I believe every leader must eventually ask. If communication is the bridge through which coherence emerges, what obstructs that bridge? Because bridges rarely collapse overnight. They weaken, one obstruction at a time. And that's exactly where I would like to take you in the next part of our conversation today. We'll explore the invisible obstructions that quietly prevent communication from becoming what it was always meant to be, a bridge between human beings, a bridge to understanding, a bridge to trust, a bridge to coherence. If you're still with me, welcome to part 2 of this conversation. In the first part of today's conversation, I shared a thought that has profoundly changed the way I understand communication. Communication is not simply the exchange of information. It is the bridge through which coherence emerges, which naturally brings us to the deeper question. If communication has the power to create coherence, what prevents it? After more than 20 years of coaching, I don't believe communication breaks down because people lack communication skills. I believe communication breaks down because the bridge itself becomes obstructed. Imagine standing at the entrance of a beautiful bridge. On one side stands your intention. On the other side stands another human being. Between you is the possibility of understanding. But now imagine placing obstacle after obstacle across the bridge. Eventually, communication doesn't stop because the bridge disappears. It stops because movement becomes impossible. The same thing happens inside every conversation. I would like to share with you 6 of the most common obstructions I have observed. Not just in organizations, but in marriages, in families, in relationships, executive teams, and more profoundly, inside of ourselves. The first obstruction is assumption. Assumption is one of the quietest destroyers of coherence. The moment we believe we already know what someone means or is about to say, curiosity disappears. We stop exploring. We stop asking questions. We stop discovering. We begin listening through memory instead of presence. Have you ever finished someone else's sentence and then realized you were wrong? Interpreted their intentions before they finished speaking, only to recognize you were completely off base? Decided what they meant based on something they may have said 6 months ago? We've all done it. Assumption doesn't create understanding. It replaces understanding with certainty. And certainty is often the end of curiosity. In an attempt to establish safety and control, we destroy the bridge of communication. The second obstruction is projection. Projection is even more subtle. Projection occurs when we stop hearing another person's reality and begin hearing our own fears reflected back to us. Someone offers feedback, we hear rejection. Someone asks a question, we hear criticism. Someone needs space, we hear abandonment. The conversation taking place externally is no longer the conversation happening internally. Our past begins speaking louder than the present. This is why integration matters so deeply, because the less integrated we are, the more likely we are to communicate with ghosts instead of people. The third obstruction is protection. Every nervous system has one primary responsibility: to keep us safe. The challenge is the nervous system doesn't always distinguish between physical danger and psychological discomfort. I'm sure you remember the paper tiger example from past episodes. So when a conversation feels vulnerable, our survival strategies quietly activate. Some of us become defensive, some withdraw, some over-explain, some become controlling, some seek approval, others simply shut down. From the outside, it looks like poor communication. From the inside, it is sheer protection. And protection is the enemy of genuine connection. Because when I'm protecting myself, I am no longer fully available to understand you. The fourth obstruction is certainty. This one often surprises leaders. We tend to believe certainty creates confidence. But I've found that certainty often creates rigidity. Curiosity says, help me understand, and certainty says, I've already decided. Curiosity expands possibility. Certainty narrows it. One of the greatest shifts in my own leadership happened when I realized that asking a powerful question often created more movement than offering a brilliant answer. Great communicators don't always have the best responses. They create the safest space for discovery. The fifth obstruction is fragmentation. This may be the deepest obstruction of them all. Because sometimes the greatest communication challenge isn't between two people. It is within one person. A part of us wants to speak honestly, another part fears conflict. A part of us wants to trust, another part of us remembers betrayal and humiliation. Part of us wants to lead courageously, another part still seeks approval. And suddenly, our communication becomes fragmented. Our words move in one direction, and our nervous system moves in another. People don't know which message to believe. And almost instinctively, they always trust the nervous system. Because human beings are remarkably attuned to incongruence. We're wired for this. We feel it long before we can explain it. The sixth obstruction is ego. The final obstruction is the one we notice least in ourselves. Ego quietly transforms communication from an act of discovery into an act of defense. The purpose of the conversation suddenly changes. Instead of understanding, we begin persuading. Instead of learning, we begin proving. Instead of building a bridge, we begin winning an argument. But here's the paradox. Every time communication becomes about winning, both people lose. Because understanding was never created. Only positions became stronger. Which brings me to something I believe is one of the most important distinctions in leadership. The quality of our communication is rarely determined by the sophistication of our language. It is determined by the quality of our presence. Communication doesn't begin with words. It begins with awareness. It begins with internal architecture. It begins with coherence. Which brings me to something I believe is one of the most important distinctions in leadership. The quality of our communication is rarely determined by sophistication of our language. It is determined by the quality of our presence. I hear this so often from leaders saying, I need to work on my communication skills. I need to take some eloquence training. And I always respond, let's begin by working on your coherence. Communication doesn't begin with words. It begins with awareness. It begins with the nervous system. It begins with internal architecture. It begins with coherence. This is why every episode of their first season was quietly preparing us for this very conversation. Integration removes distortion. Internal architecture reorganizes perception. Internal authority creates stability. Executive presence becomes visible naturally. And communication becomes the natural expression of coherence. Not because we learn better techniques, but because there is less interference traveling across the bridge. Perhaps that's the real purpose of communication. Not to convince another person to think like us, but to create enough safety that two different realities can become one shared understanding. And when that happens, something extraordinary emerges. Not agreement, not compliance, coherence. And in the final part of today's conversation, I would like to leave you with a practical reflection, a simple exercise that may forever change the way you approach every important conversation. I call it the coherence audit. Welcome to part 3. As we come to the end of today's conversation, I would like to leave you with one final reflection. Throughout this episode, we've explored a simple yet profound idea. Communication is not merely the exchange of information. It is the bridge through which coherence emerges. That means every conversation presents us with a choice. Will I create greater coherence or greater fragmentation? Will I leave this person feeling more understood or more alone? Will this conversation move us closer to one another or further apart? The beautiful thing about communication is that it doesn't ask us to be perfect. It asks us to be present, to be curious, to be willing to cross the bridge toward another human being before expecting them to cross towards us. Because perhaps that is what leadership has always been, the willingness to take the first step, not toward agreement, but toward understanding. I would like to leave you with an exercise that I hope you will carry into every meaningful conversation. I call it the coherence audit. Before your next important conversation, pause, take a slow breath, and ask yourself this question. What is my true intention? Am I entering this conversation to understand or to convince? To connect or to control? To discover or to defend? Now ask yourself, what am I bringing onto the bridge? Am I bringing assumptions or curiosity? Am I bringing certainty or openness? Am I bringing my past or my presence? Am I responding to this person or reacting to an old story? Then ask yourself something even deeper. Is my inner world aligned with my outer words? If I say I trust, do I actually trust? If I say I'm listening, am I truly listening? If I say I value this relationship, does my behavior communicate it? Remember, people don't experience our intentions. They experience our coherence, our congruence. Finally, after the conversation has ended, take a few moments to reflect. Ask yourself, did this conversation create more clarity or more confusion? More trust or more distance? More possibility or more protection? Did the other person leave feeling heard or simply managed? And perhaps the most important question of all, did I become a bridge or did I become another obstruction? Because every conversation leaves something behind. A little bit more trust or a little less. A little more courage or a little more hesitation. A little more coherence or a little more fragmentation. Leadership is built one conversation at a time, not through dramatic moments, but through thousands of ordinary interactions that quietly shape the cultures we lead, the relationships we nurture, and the legacy we leave behind. I often say that leadership is an energetic experience long before it is an intellectual one. People may forget our presentations. They may forget our strategy. They may even forget our words, but they rarely forget how they felt in our presence. That they feel safe enough to speak, that they feel respected enough to disagree, that they feel seen, that they leave with greater clarity, that they leave with greater hope. That is the true power of communication, not the ability to transmit information, but the ability to cultivate coherence. And that's why communication isn't simply a leadership skill. It is an act of stewardship. Every conversation is an opportunity to leave another person, a team, or an organization more coherent than we found it, to reduce friction instead of adding to it, to create understanding instead of assumption, to replace judgment with curiosity, to build bridges where walls once stood. Because when coherence grows, trust grows, relationships deepen, teams flourish, organizations become healthier, and leadership becomes something far greater than influence. It becomes a force that helps people flourish together. Before we close, I would like to leave you with one final thought. The next time someone tells you that your communication needs work, or perhaps you receive feedback that you need to become more influential, more persuasive, more executive, more impactful, pause before rushing to learn another communication technique. Instead, ask yourself a different question. What is interfering with my coherence? Because perhaps what is being brought to your attention isn't a communication problem at all. Perhaps it is an interference problem. Perhaps your communication is being filtered through fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of disappointing others, fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough. When those fears become active, communication stops becoming an expression of who we are. It becomes an act of protection. We brace, we over-explain, we defend, we withdraw, we seek approval. We try to control the outcome instead of remaining present within it. From the outside, it appears to be a communication challenge. But beneath the surface, it is a coherence challenge. This is why my work has never begun with influence or persuasion or presentation skills. Those certainly have their place, but they are not the foundation. The foundation is removing the internal interferences that obstruct coherence. Because when interference is reduced, clarity emerges, presence emerges, trust emerges, and communication begins to flourish naturally. Not because you've learned how to sound more convincing or eloquent, but because your words are finally expressing an integrated human being. Great communicators aren't those who have mastered the art of speaking. They're those who have mastered the art of becoming coherent. And when coherence is present, communication is no longer something you do. It becomes a natural expression of who you are. Because communication doesn't fail because language is weak. Communication falters because coherence is obstructed. Thank you for joining me on the first episode of Season 2 of Through the Valley. If today's conversation resonated with you, I would like to ask you one favor. Share this episode with someone who leads others, a colleague, a friend, a manager, a senior executive, or someone who perhaps wants to master self-leadership. Someone who understands that leadership is not simply about communicating more effectively, but about becoming the kind of person through whom coherence can emerge. And if Through the Valley continues to add value to your own journey, I would be incredibly grateful if you followed the podcast and left a review. It helps these conversations reach more leaders who are committed not only to achieving success, but to creating a more coherent world through the way they lead. And now, I leave you with this. Shift your psychology to shift your energy and transform your leadership. Until next time.